Well, the Ghanaian city has depreciated by as much as 30% between January and June this year. That's according to publications by Bloomberg. And even though the finance ministry has a different opinion about the currency, that's the city being ranked amongst the three worst performing currencies in the world, the evidence complements the realities that we're faced with when it comes to the performance of the city against the major trading currencies. But we want to understand the basis for this, the history of the city depreciation, and then after recalling the history, we put it in perspective as to why we are faced with this situation now and what can be done to address the depreciation of the city against not just the major trading currencies like the dollar and the pound or the euro, but even compared to some of the currencies within the sub-region, you see also the city performing not too well. So what is the way forward? My name is Alfred Okansi, and I'm here with Dr. John Kwakye. He is a director of research at the Institute of Economic Affairs, IEA, and we're having the development dialogue and conversations put together by the IEA. Dr. John Kwakye, thank you so much for sitting with us. So let's understand this. Can you put the city crisis in perspective in terms of its severity and the history, how we have gotten to this point?
Yeah, certainly. The city's problem goes back, several decades. In fact, we can go as far back as when the city was introduced by Kwame Nkrumah in 1965. Before that, we were using the pound, the Ghana pound, as our currency. Now, not long after, well, a couple of years after 65, that's 71, when Buzia then was in power, he devalued the currency because it was already overvalued. In other words, it had depreciated. And you will see the difference between, if you have an official exchange rate, there will also be a black market rate. So when that gap is so wide, you can really see that your currency is, the official value is overvalued. So Buzia devalued the currency. And that led to his overthrow by Achampong. He cited it as one of the reasons he overthrew Buzia in 71. So when he removed Buzia in 72, he revalued the currency, Achampong. Yeah, since then, the military regimes that came into power, well, they maintained virtually a fixed exchange rate. So up to 1983, we exchange rate. And the exchange rate was then 2.75 cedis to the dollar. Then since 1983, we started liberalizing the foreign exchange market, and we adopted a flexible exchange rate regime. So since then, the city started depreciating. We allowed it because it was a flexible exchange rate regime. And from the 2.75 in 1983, by 2007, when we redenominated, it had gone up to 10,000. So from 2.75 in 1983 to 10,000 in 2007. And that's why we knocked off 4 zeros, from the currency, and then introduced this new Ghana currency that was almost at par, one-on-one with the dollar. And since then, so like from one to one until today, when we have 10 to 1. And today's 10 cedis is 100,000. So even from 2007, we've moved from 1 to 1, which was then 10,000 to 100,000. It tells you that the city depreciation is not just recent, the crisis that we are facing. It dates back, several decades since we adopted the currency. And as for the reasons, it is just you import and then use the services of foreigners. Then if there's a gap between the two, supply and demand, then it causes your currency to depreciate. And because there has been this consistent gap between supply and demand, that is why the cedi has been depreciating all these years. Now, the crisis we are facing now is like, it is just exposed our vulnerabilities. It's partly from the external sector and some of the uncertainties we are experiencing in the economy of late. That has accentuated the problem, but it has also exposed our existing structural vulnerability.
But how much of the economic situation we face now can be blamed on external factors, i.e. COVID and the Russia-Ukraine war?
Well, specifically about the cedi, it is partly, well, you can blame it partly on exogenous factors, external factors, but also partly on domestic factors, because there's something called confidence, in your economy and in your currency. If that confidence it becomes eroded, then it can generate this kind of, crisis for you. And if you remember, we started at a point where, government's budget, there was a stalemate in Parliament. That created a lot of uncertainty. So the investor community were not sure whether we pass a budget. The e-levy, they were not sure. So they were not sure whether government was going to be able to raise enough revenue to be able to meet its debt payments and so on. So they started disinvesting, from the investment that they had made in Ghana. And then our access to international bond markets also became virtually closed. So that created the initial problem that has, continued.
Well, the IMF has maintained consistently that, in their view, the major reason why we came to the fund was because of the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war after COVID dealt a heavy blow to the global economy and indeed Ghana as well. The likes of the former President John Mahama and some economists disagree that there are some local factors that may have contributed or that actually contributed to the situation we're faced with now. Is the IMF's conclusion consistent with what the IEA knows or the reality of the situation on the ground?
Well, of course, they are talking about the larger, Ghanaian economic crisis, and not just about the cedi. Yes, so it's the larger, Ghanaian economic crisis. Of course, we all accept that, external factors, Russia-Ukraine war, and then also COVID-19 has contributed to, affected many economies around the world. It's not only Ghana, okay? But some have been able to withstand these shocks much better than we have done, okay? Look at where our inflation rate is, almost 34%. Most countries, even who have also faced these same problems, have much lower rates of inflation. And the rate at which our currency has also depreciated, as we are talking about, has been much higher than what other countries have experienced. This tells us that we were more vulnerable, we were not sufficiently prepared as other countries. And it comes to, as I said, other countries must have built buffers, economic buffers, and so that they could have withstood the shocks, much better than we have been able to do. That's also part of our problem. So it is both externally generated as well as, and some of the problem is internal.
If you look at the comparative analysis, why does the cedi seem to perform not too well with, for instance, even compared to other currencies in the sub-region and on the continent of Africa, not to talk about the dollar and the pound or the euro, but even within the sub-region and the continent? Why is this the case?
Well, two things. As I said, it's a supply and demand gap, issue. So it means that we have not done sufficiently well in terms of matching our imports versus our exports. In other words, that gap, okay, is because, well, this economy, structurally, we have depended on primary commodities which don't have enough value when we export them. And then because of our narrow industrial base, we also depend virtually on every item that you can think about in terms of imports, okay? So we are heavily dependent on imports. On the other hand, we don't also add enough value to our exports. So lack of transformation of this economy, okay? But maybe you will say that other developing countries or even countries in Africa may have maybe similar economic structures. Okay, so if you put that aside, I mean the structural issues, the way that you manage your economy and the currency, can also contribute to the depreciation. Okay, if you look at the countries around us, the CFA countries, the Francophone countries, they have formed a monetary union, okay? And that monetary union, they have very strict rules that they have imposed on themselves in terms of fiscal policy, monetary policy, and even exchange rate, management, okay? So unlike us, that the central bank is independent and able to, print money, lend to government, anyhow. They don't allow that, okay? So they restrict, government borrowing from the central bank, and then they back as much as possible the currency, say the CFA, they back it with foreign exchange, which is deposited in the Central Bank of France to support it, okay? On the other hand, if you look at Ghana's currency, the foreign exchange backing is low, So because of that, we have over-issued the currency, which doesn't have enough foreign exchange backing. So when we take our cedis, to Bank of Ghana or banks to buy foreign exchange, they will tell us that they don't have enough because there are too many cedis circulating around. The CFA countries, they don't allow that. They restrict the issue of their currency, and it's almost 100% backed by foreign exchange. So if you are holding CFA and you go to their central bank and you want foreign exchange, you can easily get it. That's also part of the problem.
I see. Okay, but in your view, is government policy of borrowing to support the cedi prudent option and viable in that regard? Because we're already seeing the $750 million the bank, that's Afri-Exim Bank loan. We've seen the cocoa syndicated loan, $1.3 billion, which is expected to come in. And all things being equal, some $3 billion we're expecting from the IMF program. How viable and sustainable is this?
Well, as I said, if you want to safeguard your cedi, your currency, protect your currency, the best means is to use your own receipts of foreign exchange. You export, you earn foreign exchange, and use it to back it. Now, if you don't have your own cedi, your own foreign exchange, and you have to go and borrow to come and support your cedi, it is not the best, approach, and it's not even sustainable, because you see, you will get the dollars today to back the currency, and make it look strong, okay? But you must know that at some time you will have to pay back the debt, and therefore you reverse the inflow of foreign that came in the first instance. So the pressure will return to the cedi. So to me, it is not a viable or even advisable way of, even trying to support your cedi, your currency. If anything at all, you should try as much as possible to use your own foreign exchange earnings. So, like now, of course, they are involved in some kind of firefighting. So you will say that, well, maybe there's no other option, okay? But if we should get out of this, I mean, it is not a sustainable way of supporting the cedi, and we should try and move away from that.
But is there any indication that government has accepted that, yes, we've been financially indisciplined, we have borrowed and spent so much more, and so we cannot continue this way, and that the IMF program is just a stopgap measure? Do you get that sense of realization of our wrongdoing?
Well, we hope so. I mean, this government, they inherited, the previous program, and they exited the program, and somehow they gave us an indication that we're not going back. So what has happened? Of course, they will say that it is partly due to COVID and Ukraine, Russia war. You can grant them that partly, as I've said, but those are not the only sources of our problem, as I've said. Unless we tackle the structural weaknesses of the economy, transform the economy from the colonial structure, where it is now, and then also boost our industrial base, to produce most of the imports that we depend on, we import. That is the way to address the problem on a fundamental and on a long-term basis. Well, as to whether the government will do it, we always hear these commitments, to transform the economy. But in most cases, you see that the actual concrete measures taken in that direction is always lagging.
But from your analysis, will the IMF program help to stabilize the cedi in terms of the benefits expected from the policy prescriptions and the financing to be provided? I mean, the $3 billion we're expecting, all things being equal.
Yeah, I believe so. In fact, even I understand that when the government announced that it was going to the IMF, somehow it brought a bit of stability, because it gave some investors some kind of confidence. Because the IMF, what it gives you is policy credibility. So investors are all looking up to you to go to, the IMF. So just the announcement alone maybe brought some kind of stability. You get money from some funding from them, and then the IMF program can also catalyze other foreign exchange inflows. So all these coming together, and then the policy credibility, and then of course the policy discipline that they also impose on you, so that you don't spend too much, and then you raise enough revenue and you don't spend too much. All these coming together will certainly help. Okay. After the program, you need sustainable means, to support the currency. The IMF program is a short-term, sort of remedy. And after the program, as we have had experience in the past, we always go back to our old ways of financial indiscipline, and that creates a problem for us. So unless we are able to impose the financial discipline on ourselves, that is the only thing that can sustain the currency, on a long-term basis.
But let's look at the medium to long term. What are some of the policy prescriptions and interventions, in your view, can be considered by government to help address the cedi depreciation permanently?
Yeah, on a permanent basis. Of course, as I said, this is a crisis that we are fighting now. So the firefighting, the measures may be, different from, what you need to address the problem on a long-term basis. On a long-term basis, what we need to do is to try and expand our exports, increase our exports, and then also diversify the exports, add value to our exports. Even cocoa alone, if I can use cocoa as an example, the international raw market, cocoa market, the total value is just about $10 billion, dollars, the raw cocoa market. And Ghana and Ivory Coast, between us, we produce about 60% of the world output. So you can say that out of the 10 billion, Ghana and Ivory Coast, we share about 6 billion. But the world chocolate market is worth $100 billion. So you see the difference. I don't understand why between Ivory Coast and Ghana, we should not have the biggest chocolate factory in the world. Because this is where we produce the cocoa from, okay? It is rather situated probably in Switzerland, okay? Now, you can look at we have other natural resources, that we can also use, own it, use it to develop, to link to industries, use your comparative advantage in those resources. The Guinea, recently I heard that the new military government that has taken over, they directed that all the they produce a lot of bauxite. all the bauxite mining companies should refine the bauxite internally, domestically. Don't export it in raw form. Because when you export it in raw form, the value you get out of it is very small. So we should have a gold refinery. We should have an oil refinery. We should have, as I said, cocoa, processing plant. We should create them. Kwame Nkrumah built all these industries, but somehow we collapsed all of them. And that is why we are where we are. So even though, as I said, the progress or commitment has been slow, we need to start from somewhere. We need to start now, so that in a 10 years' time or even 20 years' time, we would have, addressed this problem on a more permanent basis.
Oh, but we've seen both sides, the MPP and the NDC, try to make some interventions in the industrial sector, manufacturing, for that matter, which you've talked about. But how feasible are these prescriptions you've made? Because obviously it goes back to political leadership and the commitment, the will to carry out these.
It's difficult to speak for them. I'm not in. But from what they have demonstrated so far, I'm saying that they have not gone far enough. Whether we'll have another government or personalities that come and they will show, greater commitment. But that is why, civil society organization will also come in, so that we can do the advocacy, push them, even if reluctantly. If they are doing it reluctantly, we need to continue to advocate and then push them, so that they go along with some of these important structural changes that we think should be done.
Then I come back to the same point, you see, because there are people in power who are benefiting from the weaknesses in the system. So, for instance, the Tamale refinery is not refining. There are people who are politically connected who would take their cedi, convert it to dollars, go and import finished products, and they benefit for as long as TOR is not functioning. So will the political leadership lead the way to institute the change that you're expecting?
Yeah, so those are some of the, the political, dimensions of things. It is true that, in fact, even the reluctance of our leaders to take some of these bold measures, sometimes you wonder, why they are not doing it. For instance, why can't we take ownership of our natural resources? Why is it that when we sign contracts with foreign investors, we give away over 80% of the resource and we take just under 20%, okay? Why does that happen? And it's probably because the leaders, as you have said, because of maybe the small benefits that they get from these contracts, you see. Even take something like exemptions. We give duty exemptions on duty to be paid by importers. And we have been calling for these exemptions to be streamlined because, they are subject to abuse. And a law was passed recently to streamline this exemption. And you would have thought that this is the solution to the problem. But you read the law and it says that they've still retained exemptions for privileged individuals. And you ask yourself, who are these privileged individuals? You know that when parliamentarians import vehicles into the country, for instance, they are exempted from paying duty. Why should it be so? So those political interests, and then also the finance minister, they have left a discretion for him to be able to grant these exemptions. He has that authority. Again, why do you leave room for discretion? So those political interests, I think they are very strong, and they are some of the factors that are undermining, our progress. But once again, civil society, that is where we come in, because if we don't speak out, we can't change this. As you said, duopoly of NDC, MPP you know, I mean, it looks like they look after their own interests. I mean, you are fed of Article 71. Go into Article 71, and you will see the salaries, the benefits, the allowances of some privileged, people. And why is it that every government that comes, they preserve it? It's because of the benefits to themselves. But as I said, civil society needs to be pushing, to get change.
With the IMF program, one of the issues that stands out is the debt, Ghana's debt. And restructuring our debts is one of the major considerations in this engagement with the IMF. In fact, do you see any sense of admission, or what is going to go into the conversation about restructuring our debt in this engagement with the IMF? How challenging would that be?
I think 1.3 billion coming from the syndicated cocoa loan, and the IMF possibly 3 billion over 3 years. Now, our access to the international capital market has been blocked, so we should be talking about that. Now, if you put all these together, they can help stabilize the cedi for a while. But the system will just swallow them up. It will take up 6 months. In fact, Christmas is approaching. Importers are getting ready to make their orders. So they are waiting for these inflows to come. And they will go out demanding it. And they have, I mentioned the fact that if you issue too much of your currency also, and you don't back it with foreign exchange. So you ask yourself, where do even people get the cities to go and demand the foreign exchange? It is because we overissue it through the back door. You heard about Bank of Ghana, granting $22 billion cedis loan to government over the first half year. You heard about that when the minister presented his mid-year budget. Now, that is a lot of money that has been injected into the system. When government gets money, they also spend it. They spend it, they pay people, they pay contractors, they pay employees. So it gets into the system. That 22 billion is probably out there in the system. And somebody will take it to the bank and say, me too, I want foreign exchange. Okay? And you can't meet it all. So the cedi injections is also part of the problem. Apart from the fact that you have structural issues, that you are not exporting enough and you are also importing too much, okay? You are also fueling the problem by issuing more and more cedis. And that's why the safer countries are better off, because they don't allow that to be done, okay? So, because Togo is not a stronger economy than Ghana. But why is the safer always appreciating? Because they restrict the issue of it. They restrict the issue. France, the central bank, keeps their foreign exchange reserves and makes sure that before you issue CFAs, you have the backing, foreign exchange backing for it. Okay? That is it. So the structural issues and then the demand pressures that also come from you over issuing your currency.
Now, from what I'm gathering, Sri Lanka has also presented its own debt restructuring to the IMF. It didn't leave it for the IMF to do it. And they're not alone in this. Other countries that have engaged or are still engaging the IMF have developed or drawn out their debt restructuring program. Now, in your view, what challenge do you see government of Ghana facing in the process of drawing up our debt restructuring, if the IMF is going to consider that?
Well, I thought debt restructuring probably will be part of, the outcome of the program itself. I mean, the IMF will be able to help us negotiate some kind of debt restructuring with our creditors. So I thought that would probably be part of the program, so that you lengthen the maturities. In other words, those debts that are coming due, you prolong their maturities, and so on. Sometimes, some of the debt, you may get what they call debt buybacks. In other words, you discount the value of the debt and sell it to somebody else who wants to hold it, and that kind of thing. So it will have to be a whole package of measures to restructure the debt, and therefore ease the burden of the debt service payment, because that's also a very big burden. I mean, how much we pay in terms of interest. We use over 40% of our tax revenue to pay interest on our debt. And then we are left with just 60% to do all other things. That is quite burdensome. So if we get a debt restructuring out of the IMF program, it will ease the burden on our budget, for us, at least during the tenure of the program.
Dr. John Kwakye, I thank you very much for your time. Dr. John Kwakye is the Director of Research at the Institute of Economic Affairs, IEA, and conversations about the development, industrialization, and the way forward is what we've been talking about, and also under the auspices of the Institute of Economic Affairs, IEA, charting the path of development and also industrialization. These are the conversations. My name is Alfred Kansi. Thank you very much.